My story is that, like a lot of undergraduates, I flitted around. I always knew, I think from the time I was in high school, that I was going to be a scientist of some kind, and it didn't matter to me a lot which kind, physics, geology, you name it. And I went off to college and I studied first sociology and didn't really have a burning passion for sociology. And then I decided that I loved big ideas and I went into philosophy. And I decided when I was in philosophy that the big ideas I liked most were about politics. And then I thought, well, maybe I should do political philosophy instead of philosophy. And then I got into political philosophy and discovered that what I really liked about politics was the science part of it, which got me back to where I started in high school. And my sort of extraordinary experience is that on one occasion, someone put a box of what we then called punch cards in my hand and said, go ask an original question with these cards and you can figure out the answer. And that was so exciting, I've never forgotten the experience, the idea that there were questions that mattered, that you could just go out and do research on them yourself and not go and read what someone said in the library, and that excitement never wore off. What's the biggest puzzle in public opinion? I think it's more a conundrum than a puzzle, and that's the fact that everything we know about individual members of the public say that they are inattentive. They don't pay much attention to politics. They don't care much about politics. They don't know much about politics. And all that leads us to believe that public opinion would be incoherent and unfocused. And in fact, it isn't. It's focused and coherent and responsive to what's going on in Washington. And that dualism keeps me going. The principal lesson of the book, I think, is the dualism, the almost unimaginable ignorance of the typical American about politics, combined with the fact that when we put together a couple 100 million of those ignorant people, intelligence emerges. And that both of those facets are true, the ignorance and the intelligence. Yeah, the sad part of the story is one of the things that got me excited about public opinion back when I first got into it, when I had that box of cards, is that we thought that everything that was conventionally believed to be true was wrong. And it was so exciting to say, you know, take that, here's your conventional wisdom about what the public believes, and we've run the cards through the sorter and it's not true. And the irony of it is that I've turned to this macro level of analysis. In the process of doing so, I discovered that the conventional wisdom that I once despised holds up pretty nicely. So now I'm reestablishing the conventional wisdom. The conventional wisdom that things more or less make sense. That government does something and the public responds in an intelligible way, and that leads to another response and so forth. Yeah, our conception of public opinion from the very beginning was answering the question of what's going on in an individual person's head when he or she decides to have some feeling about politics. And by deciding that early on, we ignored the fact that there's another reality of public opinion, and that's the truly public part of it. That is to say, we all share opinions with one another, and a reality of what public opinion means emerges at the aggregate level that's very different from the reality in people's heads. And in particular, the reality of opinion in people's heads can be often confused and disorganized. And yet when millions of confused and disorganized people start talking to one another, a coherent message emerges. The work in trust started as a work on a variety of related topics, and in the way that's true of a lot of our work, it started from a graduate seminar. At least that's been true of a lot of my work. I worked with some really talented graduate students who were doing things in a research seminar. The young woman, Jennifer Anderson, decided she wanted to learn how the public responded to U.S. senators. And all we had were individual polls of how Senator A and State B was doing at a particular time. And we decided that it would make sense to and since we had the technology to do so, to put that all together and to look at all 100 senators at all times and try to understand what was the nature of the response to senators in general instead of just a particular senator at a particular time. And another student in the same course had decided he wanted to study approval or disapproval of Congress, which is basically a single survey item. How do you feel about the United States Congress, more or less? And at the end of that course, the two of them put that together and had both sides of the congressional puzzle, how people feel about Congress and how people feel about senators. And a third student named Luke Keel was working on a doctoral dissertation on trust. And one of the things that he quickly discovered was that despite the sense of awe that we all have about this concept of trust, that it's somehow fundamental to democracy and that it's a barometer of how healthy or sick the system is, that fundamentally trust involves people's response to how well things are going, and pretty much it's not an oversimplification to say it involves a simple response to the state of the economy at any given moment. If the economy is down, trust is down. If the economy is up, trust is up. And it doesn't then therefore mean anything fundamental. Well, I started putting together all of those pieces, how people respond to the president, how people respond to senators, how people respond to the House of Representatives, how people respond to state governors, how people feel trust in government. And in the course of putting them together, it became manifestly obvious that they moved together, that they were high at the same times and low at the same times, and that meant that there had to be some sense to which they were really all the same thing in different guises. That what people mean when they say that Senator X is doing a good job must be pretty different than a personnel evaluation of Senator X. It is indeed. I mean, this conclusion fundamentally means that trust is just a garden variety attitude like others, and it deserves the same amount of disrespect as we have for other attitudes. Right. If you read a newspaper story in 2010, and I assure you there are many of them saying that trust is at a near all-time low, should we be concerned? The answer is no. The economy is at a near all-time low in 2010. When the economy recovers, trust will also recover. Simple story. Yes, all these other interpretations of trust, that they somehow involve sort of systematic alienation from politics or democracy and some sense of disgust or something, are just interpretation added on top of an attitude which probably is fairly shallow. When things are going well, we say we trust the government. When they aren't going well, we don't trust as much, and it resolves itself. We used to feel a sense about trust in government of then and now, that in the glory days of the 1950s, when the grandfatherly Eisenhower was president, Americans were trusting in government, and those were the good times. And now are the bad times, when the level of trust is lower. But the truth of the matter is that it's always varied a lot, and the all-time high is after September 11th, 2001. When for some reason the fact that the nation was presented a crisis and government somehow acted led more Americans to trust in government than ever before or since. Was I surprised? Yes, indeed I was. I'm not totally shocked, because I had indication that things went together, but it was a surprise to see the degree to which they go together. And that leads to a fundamental reinterpretation, that when people say they approve or trust, it doesn't really mean that they approve or trust. It just means that more or less things are going well or more or less things are going badly. And in particular, what we see over and over again is that approval of public officials seems to have nothing whatsoever to do with what they've actually done in office. That if a particular person is angry on a day because their garbage wasn't picked up, they hold Barack Obama responsible, as if he were the guy hanging off that yellow garbage truck who should have picked up the garbage that morning and didn't. They hold him responsible. And when American athletes do well in the Olympic Games, we give the credit to the President of the United States, who had absolutely nothing to do with that outcome. And so the interpretation that arises that people approve when they're feeling good about things and they disapprove when they're feeling bad about things, and it's not really an evaluation of particular public officials at all. One of the interesting observations, I've noted that September 11th was an all-time high in trust of Americans for their government, and in some cases you could see that. You could think of, for example, Mayor Giuliani in New York City, who had performed spectacularly in the midst of a crisis, and maybe Governor Pataki of the state of New York, because he had a responsibility for dealing with that crisis. But then we turned to the rest of the country. The other 49 states had governors, and all their trust went up too. They didn't do anything. They just stood on the sidelines, and yet for some reason they became more trustworthy after September 11th than they had been before. I'd say give us 2 quarters of 4% growth in GDP, problem solved. Yeah, that would be because people were feeling better, and when people feel better, they give credit to public officials, even when those public officials do not deserve it, or blame when they do not deserve it. The analogy is that when a baseball team has had a bad season, we don't really think the manager had much of anything to do with that bad season, but we fire the manager. Right. And we feel the same about presidents and senators. When things aren't going well, it's their responsibility. Yeah, people do focus on what's actually going on to some degree, and how good or bad they feel about it to another degree. And therefore, to some degree, that does hold government responsible. So, for example, the White House can't just wish that the economy would get better and have it happen. So there's a sense of connection there. But where the connection breaks down is that we, the public, hold politicians responsible for for outcomes they could not possibly have influenced also. Yeah, my argument is that there is a visible reward and punishment that goes on in the public that makes sense when we observe it, but that has aspects that don't make a lot of sense. One of those is, for example, one can understand why George Bush was immediately approved after September 11th. He was the symbol of the nation and making defiant speeches and so forth. But one can't understand why the governor of California was immediately approved after September 11th, an event that occurred a continent away in which he had nothing to do. But nonetheless, the same thing happened. As things play out over the longer term, presidents get blame and credit, sometimes for things that they deserve and sometimes for things that they don't. At the moment we're speaking, Barack Obama is receiving inordinate blame for a bad economy that he inherited, and if it recovers, he will receive credit for the recovery, whether in fact he is due credit or not. The research that I'm working on now is trying to come to terms with a problem I call the problem of conflicted conservatism in the United States. That is that Americans overwhelmingly like to think of themselves as conservatives. It's a word that just has a positive buzz, and you would think from the evidence of how many Americans say that they are conservative that we were a profoundly conservative nation. The reality is shockingly different, which is that when asked questions about what they want government to do or not to do, the opposite result obtains. Americans on average choose the left or liberal side. They want government to be bigger, to spend more, to regulate more, to do all the things that constitute liberalism. Yet in the aggregate they despise this word liberal. So I'm trying to come to terms with that contradiction, and particularly a set of particular people who call themselves conservatives proudly, and then right up and down the line, given a question of what government should do or not do, choose the liberal response. And I call these people conflicted conservatives, and I'm trying to understand what's going on in their heads that they could be so attracted to symbols of conservatism and so turned off by the reality of it. The answer I know in part is that religion has a very great deal to do with it, in the sense that people do not understand what the word conservative means in politics, and we have fairly good evidence that the misunderstanding is quite substantial. And yet many of those same people would describe themselves as religious conservatives, and they do understand what conservatism means in religion. It means being evangelical, believing that the Bible is literally true, and a variety of similar things. And so we think part of the issue is that people for whom religion is vastly more important than politics know what they are in religion and what they are as conservative, and so they assume that this word conservative that fits their religious beliefs also fits their political beliefs, but it doesn't. Politics seems mighty relevant to me. We deal in the questions that people talk about every day and really want to know the answers to, and that makes it exciting. So for example, in the last few days there's been a huge discussion about the declining public trust in the United States. And it's sad to say this, it's an ignorant discussion by people who engage in all kinds of speculations and don't know the facts. And those are the kinds of facts that we as scholars study, and we have answers to those questions. You know, the relevance of political science, I'm perhaps naive here, I've just never doubted it. The questions that interest me every day are pretty often political questions, and it's pretty often the case that we don't know the answers to those questions, and that just means that you've just got a string of puzzles to be solving all the time, and the last one's never solved.